Hello and welcome to the Franz van Kat interview. I'm Annette Young. Is what some would call a tripwire issue, the very touchy subject of Muslim immigration to Europe. And it's become an electoral issue across the continent, even here in France, as we head towards a presidential election coming up in 2012. In a very timely fashion, a book that deals with all the questions that issue raises has just been published in French. It's been written by Christopher Caldwell, an American journalist who also is a contributing writer to the New York Times magazine. It's entitled Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, Immigration, Islam and the West. And Christopher Caldwell joins me in the studio today. Christopher Caldwell, thanks for giving us some of your time.
Oh, I'm glad to.
Let me start by asking you, this book of yours, which it was written at a time when there are many right-wing politicians in power across Europe. Did you have any qualms about writing it? Did you worry about sort of people using what your arguments as a reason to fuel or incite hatred or racism?
No, and in fact, you know, there are already books of that sort. I found when I first started writing about this issue in the late 1990s, I wrote about it as a sort of an American type immigration story. I was just looking at how well these processes were working, you know, following articles I'd done on immigration issues in the US. After September 11th, it became a very different story, and passions really got involved in it. And what you had at the time was a lot of politically correct books, if you don't mind my using that expression, and a lot of really fiery, incendiary books, which were not paid much attention to. What I tried to do was write a very direct, non-polemical book that laid bare every aspect of the immigration problem, from, you know, just spoke frankly about things like crime rates, unemployment rates, how big a role religion played in immigrant communities, and try and open up the debate, which I found was very, very blocked up by political correctness.
Now, since the book was published in English in 2009, we've had the Arab uprising. How much impact, in fact, has it had any impact at all on the Muslim diasporas living in Europe, do you think?
Not directly, but I think that there's probably some pride in identifying with this. There is a wind of change, if you will, blowing across the Muslim world, and it would be very surprising if Muslim communities in Europe, who after all watch the news from their ancestral lands with a good deal of attention, it would be very surprising if they did not draw some inspiration from that.
Your book, however, doesn't really strike a particularly optimistic tone, does it? I mean, you stress at the end that European society being insecure and malleable and coming up against a culture such as Islam, which is seen as being anchored, confident and strengthened by common doctrines, that the former will change in order to suit the latter.
That's right. I think as a general rule, historically, immigration helps strong cultures very much, but tends to submerge weak cultures. An example of a country that is made strong by immigration would have been the United States in the late 19th century, or Australia in the 20th. An example of a country that's made weak by immigration would be New Spain, that is Mexico, by the immigration of United States people into Texas. What happened was they wound up losing Texas. So this varies. But I don't think I'm as pessimistic as you let on. I don't rule out that that Europe will find some solutions to this. What I do say, though, is that everyone is very keen to talk about what an enrichment immigration is to our cultures, and of course it is. As anyone who's ever had an Indian meal in London will know, it does enrich our cultures in many ways. But there's also a price for it. And that price gets paid economically. It gets paid in terms of an erosion of a culture that people had been used to. And it gets paid in the form of rights, because you have to give up doing certain things you used to do to accommodate a different culture. So, and now Europe is beginning to pay the price. And as Europeans begin to pay the price, a lot of European people begin to say that they were not consulted about immigration.
Do you think you see your book as a wake-up call for the European intellectual elite?
Wow, that would be, I hope it is that, among other things, you know. What I tried to do was discuss, frankly, every aspect of the immigration problem in a way that would be listened to.
But you were accused of stoking Islamophobia.
And one of the big problems is that the groupthink of European intellectual elites. There's an absolute inability to just have an honest discussion about, for example, how much low-income housing costs in Holland, or how high the rates of crime are in particular suburbs in France, or how religious are French immigrants. A study came out this week by Gilles Kepel in the Institut Montaigne in Paris, which is not a radical group by any stretch of the imagination, that found a great rise in Islamic identification in Clichy-sous-Bois and other problem suburbs.
In Paris, here in Paris.
Yes, around Paris. These are the suburbs that were involved in the riots of 2005. And in 2005, when Alain Finkielkraut, the French philosopher, said, well, you know, there's a degree of Islamist or third world identification in these suburbs. When he was brave enough to say that, he was not only attacked in public, he was hauled into court. He was sued for having the temerity to say that. So I think there's a very locked down sort of self-censorship among most intellectuals that is a big part of the problem.
And as you say, it's impossible, in your opinion, to have a sort of a reasonable argument without people being attacked, if indeed they veer off what is deemed to be the political correct path, and raising issues. Do you think that's something that can be overcome, though?
It has to be overcome. And you know, these things tend to be overcome when a crisis gets too big. I mean, if you compare it to the finance crisis, there was not that much open dissent about our economic system, not as much as there is now that we're all heading into the gutter, you know what I mean? In the same way, when things happen like the riots in France in 2005, the riots in Britain more recently, although their link to immigration and ethnicity is less clear than the French riots were. When things like that happen, people either have to talk about them, or they'll just be, without talking about these things, you can't solve these problems. So this discussion will force itself on the public.
But is the onus just on the European community, or is it also on the Muslim community themselves, in that sense of confronting the radical tendencies as that you know, research established?
Yes, well, yes, it is, and you know, one always wants to see responsibility at the level of the community. On the other hand, you know, if you put yourself into the shoes of Muslim community leaders, or any community leaders in multicultural Europe, the broader society has not been terribly clear about what it expects out of them. And so it's hard for them to know exactly what being a good citizen would mean. And so maybe the national cultures or the national governments need to be more clear about what they expect.
And what would you suggest? What, for instance, should French authorities do, given the fact that there is now increasing radical tendencies, according to this institute, occurring right there in their own backyard?
Now, here is a place where you might be disappointed in my book, because it's not a part of, you know, being frank in a way that involves being listened to means being apolitical. And this book is not a manifesto. I do not have a 10 or 20 point plan for what these countries should do. But I do think that these things have to be, these laws and these approaches have to be settled at the level of the nation, not at the level of the EU. And you see that, you know, an Anglo-Saxon culture of the British or American sort could not really ban the veil in the way that a country with an official national culture, the way France has been able to do in schools.
So it has to be a state-by-state basis?
I think it does, yes. I think that they need to be very clear about the way we do things here and have always done things here, and that needs to be made clear to people before they come.
Christopher Caldwell, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. That's it for this edition of the Franz van Kat interview. Stay tuned for more news and headlines, which are coming up shortly.